Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to have you here today. This is a very interesting session we are going to have today, and this is brought to you by Virtual Internships, the British Council, and CRCC Asia. And you are here as part of the Generation UK program, which at a certain moment you have finished, you have completed a virtual internships with us in China, or you're just starting doing so. So we believe you're very interested in China, its culture, and to discover the very interesting topic we prepared for you today, and for which we brought three very interesting speakers who will share a little bit about what work and culture is like in China. So before we start with our topic today and with our webinar, let's explain a little bit how the dynamic works. Okay, so we are recording this session, so you can rewatch it later on if you really liked it, or you can share it with other people who may be interested. And we are uploading this afterwards in our YouTube channel. Okay, in our YouTube channel, you can subscribe and you can find other webinars that we run at Virtual Internships. These are employability webinars where we discuss different interesting topics on employability and global work. So you can subscribe and find our latest webinars there. So please ask questions. The idea is that you have the opportunity to ask questions and exchange with our panelists. So you will find the Q&A section below. Please write your questions, and by the end of the session, we'll allocate a time to answer them. So I will first ask some questions, and then we'll take your questions, and we can all have a nice discussion. So, as you know, today's topic is we're going to discover what work and life culture is in China. And for that, we have these amazing speakers, and we have Ross Parsonage. Ross has worked in the legal services industry and the well-being industry in Beijing for more than 20 years. So he has a lot of experience, and he's from the UK. So he will share his insights and perspectives as also a British person. And then we have Helen Fan. Helen, she has lots of experience working in international companies, Chinese company in China. She's from China, and she works as our partnership development manager here in Virtual Internships. And then we also have Allison Ross. Allison Ross, she is the head of intern experience at Virtual Internships, and she spent more than 4 years also living and working in China. She's from the US. So we have a very interesting and diverse panel who will share their impressions of life and work in China. So thank you everyone for being here today. I'm very happy that you're here. And so first of all, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you from you yourself. So Ross, could you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So yes, I'm from Portsmouth in the UK originally, albeit I haven't lived in the UK now for the best part of 20 years. I graduated in 98, went traveling and ended up in China by accident and fell in love with the place. So as many new foreigners exploring new lands, I taught English for the first year, which was a great opportunity for me to get to know the local Chinese, to get to know some of the culture, but more importantly, to start studying the language. And didn't want to leave. And that's been the case for the last 20 years. There's always been something there that's kept me wanting to stay there and live there. I met my wife there. I've set up my own business there. So China has a very a huge part of my life. I kind of grew up there. So very pleased to be here today to be able to talk on this panel. Right now, I'm transitioning from my previous role as a lawyer. I practiced law in China for 15 years, and I'm now working with my wife to build up a well-being consultancy, and we have a yoga studio in Stanleyton, in Beijing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ross. Helen, would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself? Your mic is off, yeah.
If that works?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Marta. And hello, everyone. It's glad to introduce myself and join this panel now. And I work for virtual internship from Beijing, the capital city of China. And before joining virtual internship, I work for Chinese government, named Chinese Academy of Science for more than 6 years. And I do also have more than 15 years of working experience in the International Education Corporation of Singapore, Australia, and Britain from China. I mainly focus on the partnership relations and business development in the higher education fields. And I'm the mainly service of the career internship and the study abroad to the college students.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Helen. Yeah. Allison?
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Allison Ross, and I'm head of intern experience here at Virtual Internships. So many of you have probably met one of my two colleagues, either Nadia or Michaela, who have been working with you a little more hands-on throughout the course of your internship, but I'm in a similar role with them. A little about my China journey is I first visited China as just part of a university exploration in 2010, also to go to the Shanghai World Expo at the time. And then I spent some time studying abroad there between 2011 and 2012 in Beijing. I then returned and did graduate school in the UK and lived and worked in the UK for almost 3 years before moving back to China in 2018, and I moved back to Shanghai. I started out working in primarily a Chinese company, but also in the higher education sector. Before transitioning, I worked with CRCC Asia as their Shanghai general manager, and I've just recently left Shanghai at the end of 2021.
Excellent. Thank you, Alison. Well, as you can see, so many interesting experiences working and living in China. So I'm already excited. So, okay, so let's just get to explore a little bit so you can share with us. So I think my first question, and me, I don't know much about China, so this is going to be very fun. I think I'd like to know, how could you describe work culture in China, right? We're all about thinking, okay, global employability, how is it to work in China? How is this work culture look like? Ross, what could you share with us?
Thank you. I mean, obviously that's a very difficult question to answer because there's no one experience that encapsulates what it's like to work in China. Obviously, work culture differs in different industries, different cities, at different levels. I mean, for me personally, I've been lucky that I've worked for a British law firm in China, and I've worked with amazing colleagues, incredibly hardworking, incredibly professional, the best of the best, very, very good experience. I can share with some vignettes, some stories about how I've worked with that and how I've learned to kind of adapt in that culture. But I think in general, I mean, the Chinese are very dedicated, very hardworking, very keen to get ahead. They're trying to live this, we used to refer to it as the American dream, it's kind of the Chinese dream is to get ahead. So everybody is striving to be the best that they can. Obviously, the culture itself is very, very different. I think as a foreigner coming into that has been and continues to be a challenge. I've lost count of the number of times I've made mistakes because I've misread the situation or have been challenged, but you learn and you build on that and you become better. So yeah, I mean, there are frustrations as well. I mean, China's not perfect, as no country is, and I think work culture differs from place to place. But I think in general, you can, if you were to work in China, you can expect a very rewarding and very fast-paced. I think the one thing I would take away from all of this is China moves at a speed that you just can't believe. And at one point, at one day, I will leave China to maybe move to the US or the UK, and I worry about it slowing down, you know? So that constant energy, especially in Beijing, that is amazing.
Interesting. Helen, what can you share? How?
Yeah, I think that this topic is big topic. So from me, I'd like to share some tips for a young Britain generation to know some, and I would like to give some advice. I think first is punctuality. It's a good habit in China, and the hours of work in China is 8 per day in 5 working days from Monday to Friday. But working over 8 hours per working day are very common, especially in tier 1 city like Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, because working hard and being disciplined have been taught since they are very young. So an interesting thing that you will find that napping is acceptable and even encouraged. And for initiative thinking or sharing a point of view, I think you might want to take a stand on many things like you did back home. However, while working in China, being too upfront or upstage might be considered kind of rude to the locals. So if being upfront is always your style, I suggest you may want to take a step back with your own convenience. And the last one I want to share is for the hierarchy. Instead of calling Mr. or Mrs. or call their names directly, addressing people by their titles is very common in China, especially for the formal settings. So maybe you call them manager or director or president, principal, so and so. It's better, especially in the important greeting to these people according to their ranks.
So that's very interesting. Allison?
Yeah, kind of on a similar note, I did find working hours in Shanghai were a little longer than the US or the UK that I'd been anticipated or that I'd previously had been working for. And as Helen mentioned, punctuality was definitely a very important factor. I came in directly managing a team, but my first team was all Chinese. So having that communication with Chinese staff at the beginning was a little bit of a culture shock to me. I'll use the example of my very first team meeting. I came in with an agenda and was immediately asking for feedback about every point. And afterwards, I had a colleague say that that was a very American tactic to leading a meeting, as compared to previously some of these topics would be discussed privately and then introduced at the team meeting. So there was definitely a learning curve, especially in managing expectations and providing feedback to staff, as well as receiving from my Chinese supervisor was definitely a little bit of a learning curve, I found.
This is very interesting, right? So Helen mentioned something about if we are very upfront, that can be considered rude, right? And the way of we lead meetings. So okay, let's talk about communication later on because it sounds really interesting. And so, Rose, you mentioned something about the challenges of adapting to work, like everyone, right? When we go to a new culture, there are differences, there are new things we are discovering. So for you, Rose, what was like perhaps something very interesting and also very challenging that happened, like in culture in general or work culture? What can you share?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, both Helen and Alison have raised a number of important issues, like the way the leadership, you know, the way the hierarchy, that's very different. And also the way that you evaluate and disagree with your colleagues. Now, managing a team is challenging. I think the way in which we deal with providing feedback in the West and in China is very different. So in the West, we're a little bit more direct in terms of giving negative feedback, whereas in China, it's indirect. It's definitely not in in a group context. It always has to be done privately. And I've learned the hard way. I recall early on in my career, having regular team meetings, and this is across China, and we'd have regular weekly calls, and on a call with my team based in Shanghai, and me just not being mindful had been quite critical of a response to a particular problem. I can't remember what it was now. And one of my team members started to cry in Shanghai. And obviously my intention wasn't to cause her pain or to cause her, any personal grief. And it was not fully appreciating how she took on board my language, the way that I was dealing with this. I was just trying to go through an agenda and deal with the issue. So the only way I could deal with that was jump on a plane, go to Shanghai, take her out for dinner, sit down, have a conversation, and just talk it through. So that's one thing. The other thing about disagreements, in the West, I think we're a little bit more confrontational. In China, it's less confrontational. So the conversations, again, are kind of dealt with behind the scenes. And I like the point that Allison made. Most meetings in the West, the intention is to go in there to discuss an issue and to agree next steps. Whereas in China, most of those discussions happen before the meeting with different separate people. And it's only in the meeting that it's then presented as hey, this is what we're going to do. So again, very different way of tackling particular issues.
Interesting. Alison, was there something that you find really, really challenging? Many things I imagine, but something you said, oh, that was really a challenge for me.
Well, kind of similar to what we mentioned, expanding on Ross's point about feedback, is I found both when delivering and receiving feedback, for example, if we're working on projects A, B, and C, and we say, oh, you did a great job on projects A and C, that feedback is actually way more aimed at project B than at projects A and C, in the sense that by not pointing out the feedback from B, it's giving me all the feedback I need moving forward. So I think subtly picking up on those language cues definitely was a challenge for me at the beginning. So we mentioned, as an American and having lived in the UK, I tended to be very in my community, and this was something I had to curtail very on in order to not offend clients, but also just for me to take on appropriate feedback to grow as an employee. Another thing I found interesting was the social work aspect. In terms of if you're out at a business dinner or something, the etiquette going into the communication and where you're hosting this and that follow-up. So for example, I think in the West, we do a little bit of a dance over the check of, oh, I'll get it. No, you can get it. And it's polite to offer. And in some places, I found in some circumstances, it would be impolite to have that offer. It's just some of that business etiquette I found as Ross mentioned, I made a lot of mistakes with, to be honest, but it was definitely a learning curve. And I'm sure we're all still working on learning some of those intricacies.
Yeah, definitely. Helen, could you like to add something?
Yes, I think Ross and Allison share some lots of interesting points. And from me, I think the challenge is communication and across cultural understanding. For the communication, my advice is to learn as much as a local language as will helpful, because at least it will help to give a good communication, to give a beginning of a good communication with the local persons. So for the cross-cultural understanding, I think for me, for example, there is a predominant civilism culture in China workplace. So I think once you arrive in China, and you're going to be encouraged to get to know all your colleagues personally, and they will get back to know you as well. And while you might need to adjust yourself not to be too upfront, but you still need to act as in one big happy family at work and outside of the work. So it is common for the co-worker to spend hours together outside work, and they hang out together, drinking food, sports, and KTV, and even traveling together. It is actually contribute great to people's sense of belongings and feel more acceptable by a group. So.
That's really interesting. So that brings me to another question, which is how is it, what kind of socializing happens in the workplace, or perhaps are there like specific routines or things that people do? Like for instance, in the UK, right after people finish working, they go to the pub, they have a beer. What kind of socializing happens in the workplace or outside? How does that work, Ross?
I mean, again, I'm sure it differs among companies. I mean, from my experience working within a law firm, yes, I mean, our colleagues love to socialize. They have lots of different groups of friends. They love to go to lunch together. Lunch is a big part of their day, so they're always planning about where we're going to go and what we're going to eat, and you have your groups there. Trust in China is built very much on relationships. It's about how well you know somebody more than how good they are at doing a particular issue, particular thing, their expertise. They like to go out to drink. It used to be back in the day that karaoke was, maybe I was younger then. I don't see that as much now. And so, yeah, they're a very sociable group. They love to be given an opportunity to kind of hang out together. Some of their biggest friendships are through work. That said, I think my experience may be different from Helen's. Being a foreigner does add an additional layer of I don't want to say distance, but if you are a foreigner and be in a more senior position, then sometimes it can be quite hard to break down some of those barriers to really get into the relationships, and that just takes time and just being consistent and hanging out with them. But the Chinese like to party, as much as the rest of us. So,
Allison, what was your experience?
I think both Helen and Ross touched on some great points here that I found in general. My office, I think in the UK culture, we're used to going out to a pint on Friday afternoon and kind of closing up the week in this structure. And how Helen mentioned lunch was really important within my office, that this was something that we always did family style. We ordered from a specific restaurant and everyone was sharing dishes. And this was really our community time. And maybe it was different because a lot of my Chinese colleagues had young families. So I don't think we had quite that same socializing after work. But I do think these relationships maybe took a little bit longer for us to build, but the more time you put into that relationship, the more outcome you would see from that. And building up that was really the fundamental aspect of any Chinese business. And really just taking interest in your peers and building that up as time went on was really important to us.
Helen, is there anything else you would like to add? For instance, could it be inappropriate to reach out to a colleague after certain time, like let's say it's 7 p.m. and I need to find out something about work. Could I send a message to a colleague at that time, or could that be like you're overstepping? What do you think, Helen? How does that work?
I think, in China, WeChat is very popular. So if you send a message or even concern about work, even in the midnight, is very common. And especially I think for the people working in Tier 1 city, they are working for all the time, or even in the very early of the morning. So I think that is popular to message them.
I mean, I add a few points to that. WeChat is for those that don't know, in the UK, you need to know what WeChat is. It's like the mother app of apps. It does so many things that you'd find in the UK in one thing. And it's a relatively recent thing. Maybe the last 10 years. And so for me personally, just moving away from a work culture, which is based on email, which is relatively easy to manage, to a work culture which is based on a phone around WeChat. And I think it's good in terms of it's quicker. It's, you can move projects forward much quicker, which the Chinese like to do. What it does mean, though, is you're constantly on your phone 24 hours. And so this level of expectation that you must be on your phone ready to answer at any time is a challenge. And I think that's a problem. And that's one of the reasons that I've been looking more into the importance of well-being, because I think finding that work-life balance is becoming increasingly harder in China, not easier.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So that leads me to my next question, which was precisely about what kind of working tools are more used in China. So you mentioned WeChat, or are there any particular apps or work practices that you learned, or that you can expect someone to go to China or work for a Chinese company, and then you said, oh, this is different from what I was used to in the UK or in the US? Allison?
Well, firstly, I think WeChat is life. That work-life balance has really broken down quite a bit in China, and it's very common to get messages at all hours of the day and expect that instant communication on WeChat. There's a few different versions of WeChat that you could have, whether it's a business account or if you just utilize your personal account for both business and personal, which I think most people tended to do just for simplicity. But it did mean that there was constantly this blurring of your lines of answering questions, sending files, and communicating. In terms of any other apps, I think essentially China had the Western equivalent of every app, just called something different and utilized them slightly differently. So whether this was Weibo or Youku or however other apps, I mean, back in the day, I think I had a Renren account, which was an early version of their version of Facebook, that most of the same apps that we utilize, there is a Chinese equivalent. So whether if you're utilizing, for example, YouTube in your work on a daily basis, you'd probably be utilizing the Chinese equivalent. If you're utilizing Spotify, or whether this is personal life or professional balance, you would essentially just be shifting this to the Chinese version if you would ever have the opportunity to work in China.
Nice. Helen, is there anything you think you can add to that?
Yes, I agree with Allison. Yeah, in China, we have a saying like, without WeChat, we cannot live in. It's like a kind of joking, but it is. Everything we are living in China, not only for business, but also for everything, needs WeChat. So besides of this, in China, we do have a lot of work tools, like for the office, we use Microsoft Office. But we also use WPS and Shimo, a lot of local office app. And for the project management, like Notion, we use Tower Team Visions. And for the virtual meeting, because VPN connection, Gmeet are not popular in China, but Zoom is good. Besides of this, we use Tencent meeting. And for the office suits like G Suits and Zoho, we use Feishu, DingTalk, Wecom, and Worktel, etc. A lot of tools. So I think there you have many choices in China. I'd like to share the website if any other person's needs here.
Yeah, definitely. Please share any resources. You can even share if you have any interesting links. You can share that in the chat. So we explore this definitely. Ross, is there anything else you'd like to say? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think over time you have seen, foreign tools, foreign apps have gradually been replaced by Chinese apps. So, and some of the Chinese apps now have English language capabilities. WeChat now has an automatic translation function, which is great. But I think a lot of these apps that are used within business in China still require a relatively high level of Chinese. And if you expect to continue to work with foreign apps, then you may encounter some technological problems trying to overcome some of the kind of internet walls that are in place in China. It's just a practical reality. So I know that actually, Myrta, you and I have had problems with Zoom in the past because of having the need for VPN. So don't expect to be able to use the same tools that you use in the UK in China, but recognize that China will have tools that can do pretty much everything that you've done before. You've just got to find them and learn how to use them.
Excellent, thank you. And so I was thinking, how is it, right, for a foreigner to come to China, and how can we survive if we don't speak the language? How much do we need to learn? I understand Chinese is quite complex, to say it in a nice way. So how was your experience, Ross? Did you speak any Chinese when you arrived? How was it for you?
So I arrived in '99, and I was literally only going to be there for 2 weeks. I think a couple of things. One is, when I first arrived, I was amazed that nearly all of the foreigners that I met at that time spoke some Chinese. And I'd been traveling around Asia, and I'd never seen that before, foreigners speaking that local language. I was lucky, I guess, that when I decided to settle down in China, that I had, I was teaching English, as I mentioned before. I had a number of hours a day where I could study Chinese, and my school offered me Chinese lessons. I think that was great, to be given a sit down and scheduled number of hours of Chinese a day for a period of time really helped. And I say that because it's a difficult language to get over that initial hump. You can't just take a class and go out and really use it. And it's not the kind of language like Spanish or French where you can just absorb it by reading, all the signs around you. You need to know the characters. And so what I've seen is a lot of expatriates who've come to China through their companies, best of intentions. I want to learn the language. They can only put a few hours in a week, and after a couple of months, they kind of give up. They've got enough to get around in, maybe in a taxi, maybe in a restaurant. So Chinese is one of these languages that you really need to persevere. But once you get over that hump, it does become a lot easier. And what I would say to a lot of people, even if you only intend to go to China for 1 year, still make the effort, because from experience, 1 year can become 3, can become 7. And before you know it, you've been there for 20 years. So make the effort from the beginning, and you will be rewarded. The Chinese, they know that their language is very difficult. So to see any foreigner trying to use it at any level is praised, is loved. So do it.
Excellent. Allison, how was it for you?
Kind of similar. I in China, so I was lucky that I had almost a year of student experience of very intensive Chinese lessons as a university student prior to moving to China to work professionally. That being said, I had about a 6-year gap to have all that knowledge flee from my brain and have to relearn it a little bit. I found learning Chinese when I entered China to work professionally, it was a full-time, and as we mentioned, the hours were a little bit longer. So it was much more difficult to dedicate that time from that stage. So I was really happy to have that foundation and then just be able to expand on that and expand on the business vocabulary. I think also it made a very big difference depending on what city you were in. Speaking Chinese in Beijing was a lot more essential. Also, I was there before the age of WeChat, before the age of smartphones, of having those translation apps. So learning Chinese was really critical just for surviving. That being said, I think Shanghai was really easy. I had a lot of friends who didn't speak any Chinese who got along perfectly fine. As Ross said, I think there was something missing from that experience, not having that language and not having that tool. But I think it very much depends on where you are in China, of those tier 1 versus tier 2 cities. I'll say every time I left Shanghai to travel within the country, I was very happy I spoke at least basic Chinese to understand a little bit more what was happening around me. And as Ross mentioned, it's very much an immersive language that you're not going to pick it up just walking down the street. Having that foundation, and I found for me, especially the grammatical structures, the vocabulary kind of got filled in over time, but having basic grammatical knowledge of even structured was really important from the beginning.
Excellent. Helen, what are your thoughts on your language?
Yeah, it's interesting to, I agree with Ross and Allison's sharing, and they think Chinese is difficult. But I agree, learning some as much as you can. Chinese will be good for your communication, and don't be shy. Just trying to learn, and especially with those foreigners who has been in China for a longer period of time, to help you be prepared. And just I think most of Chinese is very have a basic English language, because they were changed from primary school. So just communicate with them, and with the first maybe 你好, 谢谢, 再见, the basic Chinese language at the beginning, and then you will get very useful support from them.
Yeah, I can imagine what Ross says about like Chinese not being a language that you can just pick by being there. So there's a lot of conscious effort and work we should put into that. So well, I think that's the beauty of languages, right? When we get that first threshold and then we start thinking, that must be super rewarding. And so Rose, was there anything in particular that you, as a British citizen, perhaps with, a British upbringing, and then you went to China, and that was like very specific to, how you were brought up and how you experienced a particular topic in China? Do you have any of that?
I do. I mean, in terms of a work context, and we talked about hierarchy earlier on. I mean, Western cultures, I think, allow employees to question their boss, even challenge them during public meetings. Whereas Chinese employees are usually kind of very deferential and don't voice contrary opinions. So, Chinese bosses are kind of typically expected to manage top down and to know the right strategies and all the answers. So that, I think, was a bit of a shock, especially if you're going into a meeting expecting people to voice their opinions or voice their concerns or help you to identify areas for improvement. You're not going to get that, I think, in that public setting. Now, again, I was working for a British company, a British law firm, and our clients were British. And so there was a general expectation and management structure that was very, very different from a typical Chinese law firm. So far more egalitarian, far more kind of horizontal, and we try to encourage people to speak out and to reward that. But again, it's still very difficult, I think, for the average Chinese person to overcome that general reluctance to challenge authority. So that to me has been and will continue to be one of the biggest differences and challenges that I saw working within that business environment.
Mm. And for you, Allison, is there anything in particular that perhaps in the States is very encouraged, and then for you it was like, oh, wow, this is also very different?
One thing I found really interesting was kind of the time management. I think Helen touched on this briefly earlier, but napping in public spaces, I found really interesting and completely new to me. That over a lunch hour, yes, there's this community family lunch style, but then afterwards, a lot of time go and take a nap for a little bit. So a lot of offices are set up with this in mind. And this was something coming from the US and the UK that I never experienced before. So just not so much on work culture, but more so something I just found really interesting. And a Chinese colleague once told me that this was supposed to be in sync with your body's natural inclinations, that at the lull of the day, you should let your body have that relaxation as well. So I think that that's something that's always struck me about China, is kind of the paradoxes of we're expected to have longer hours, be very hardworking and very productive, but then there's also these other kind of cultural nuances that are built in. So that paradox of being able to balance those two sides.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm from Argentina, but I've lived and worked in other countries. But if someone saw me napping at work, my boss here couldn't like it, right? They would be like, what's with you? So that I find it very, very surprising, definitely. Helen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think like Rose just mentioned, the Chinese don't much rely on the email, like Britain American to communicate, especially in the working, studying, and they use WeChat, they use message, they often use calls. So I think that is the big challenge for you to come to China, because when you send an email, you will usually find they never read. And you need to phone them and message them, tell them, please check your email box. And then they will, okay, and follow you. So that is the mainly difference, I think, for your work, or maybe challenge when you come to China.
I think that's a very useful piece of advice for those who are starting their virtual internship right now to consider, right? Perhaps reaching out to their supervisors over WeChat or, and finding different strategies to communicate, definitely. And Helen, so we've asked Rose and Allison, how was it for them to, discover China? How was it for you working for an international organization, different from your culture? Did you have anything like, it was like very surprising for you in your own experience?
Yes, I to be frank, I'm very like to work in virtual internship. This workplace is very international. You have when you work in this kind of international company culture, you have a lot of opportunity to communicate with a different time zone person in different culture, and it helps you to understanding your thinking in another way, and help you to look the or judge things that you never concern. So I think that's for this point, it's helped me, and in the future of work to work in the international workforce, and also to learn something more. That is the many interesting things I'm focused on during the past few years. So.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so do we have any questions from the audience? Is there anything you'd like to ask that we haven't covered yet? Let me see. So, okay, I have a question here, okay? So what piece of advice could you share with anyone thinking of living, studying, or working in China, right? If they were to prepare and right now start thinking about going to study, work, or live in China, what piece of advice could you share? Allison, perhaps, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd start with saying each city and each region is profoundly different. So understanding the history of that particular context is really important. Traveling to Dalian is going to be very different than living in Shanghai or in Kunming or in any of these regions. So understanding that China is a really big country and there are a lot of cultural differences even across China. So this might also impact what the type of host company you're working with and where your supervisor might be from, and understanding some of those differences. I found, kind of as Ross mentioned, Chinese people were incredibly welcoming, but it did take me a little bit of time to break down those barriers and really form those relationships. That putting that time in, I think in Western cultures, we might be a little used to that instant connection of we're working together, so we have this camaraderie. I think in China, it took me a while to fully integrate myself into those colleagues and into those work circles. But once I did, those relationships were a lot stronger and a lot longer lasting than I would say some of my previous professional relationships with American colleagues have been. It's, as I mentioned, a little bit of a paradox in terms of how to be assertive, but also how to respect the hierarchy. That a lot of things tended to be a negotiation while living in China. So being able to feel out when you needed to be assertive within a situation and kind of stand your ground, not necessarily within a professional sense, but I think in a personal sense, you'll probably hear a lot about negotiating at markets and negotiating on your rent prices, things along those lines. It's always has that negotiation aspect, but that doesn't really exist within the professional realm that I observed. Otherwise, in terms of moving to China, if any of you would ever have this opportunity, I think this has changed a lot from when I first went in 2010, even compared to now, in the sense that it used to be that you really had a struggle to find, Western products or to get things imported. And now I feel like that struggle has kind of disappeared, that China is very convenient, that you can get anything delivered at any time of the day. And it's very easy to manage. As Helen mentioned, there's an app for pretty much everything now. So it does take some time to understand that and work with that. But once you understand that system a little bit, it is a little bit easier. And I guess my best piece of advice, if any of you have the opportunity to either live there or even just working within your companies, is to try to break out of that Western bubble a little bit. That it's very easy to get tied into a community that is from people from a similar background from you, or to, especially in international companies, to live in this very comfortable bubble. And challenging and pushing your way out of that was very difficult, but I think way more rewarding and more impactful over time. So if any of you do have that opportunity, it is challenging and a little frustrating at times, but the payoff is very much worth it by the end.
Excellent. Rose, could you like to add anything?
I mean, look, Allison's spot on. I mean, China is an amazing place, and it's actually very difficult for me to really. What I find most interesting, when I have friends and family come and visit me in Beijing, that's when I really get to see China again, because I get to see it through their eyes, and they're able to point out the most remarkable and crazy and stupid things that I just, my day-to-day kind of experience. And so that's always fun for me. And the fact it has changed so dramatically, and kind of being there, you don't necessarily see it because it's just happening. It's just part of life. And it's interesting. When Myrta reached out to me, I went back through my old library and I picked up a book. This is, I think, 2008, maybe. So it's a good few years. And I was reading through this, and so much.
What's the name of the book? 101 Stories for Foreigners to Understand Chinese People. Oh, nice. Interesting.
And I was reading through it, and I said, yes, a lot of this applied back in 2008. But I think the two cultures have merged, especially in Beijing and Shanghai, so much that a lot of this is now kind of history. There are new cultures being developed every day. The Chinese are very good at just bringing in the best of everything and just making their own culture of it. And so it's just constantly evolving. That's why China's so captivating. So it's very difficult to say this is, but in terms of advice for anybody going to China, language, I think, is going to be important. Finding a few people on the ground who can help you overcome and quickly get grounded would be good, just so you don't have to encounter, the same kind of problems and challenges that they did. You can learn from them. I just hope that, the borders will open up soon enough that you can go and visit and work and enjoy, what China has to offer.
Definitely. Helen, could you like to add anything?
Yes, I agree with Rose, and I think for the persons based in Britain, they can learn from like LinkedIn or some blogs or some webinar that has a public information or advice for the young people to live in China. Just learn from it, and that will helpful. And by the way, the language, learn some basic Chinese, and that will helpful. Is also helpful for the virtual internships when you start with their Chinese supervisor.
Yeah, thank you. That leaves me to my next question. Someone is asking, with working virtually, what level of Mandarin would I need to have? Allison, what do you think?
I think that one's going to be very difficult depending on which type of host company you work for. Also, your communication with your supervisor is going to look like. So we expect that you'll be communicating with your supervisor on a daily basis. That being said, you probably will be pivoting from working with email to working with WeChat. WeChat does have a translator app, but I do think Chinese staff always really appreciate at least a little bit of language and during those meetings that you might be having. So I think that you should not expect your virtual internship to be in Chinese. We don't have that expectation. However, any type of language that you can share and being able to kind of go that extra mile, I think will go a lot further with your supervisors than it would perhaps with other cultures and with other languages.
Excellent, thank you. And we have another question here from the audience. Someone asks, how could you say working in China has helped your career development?
I'll tackle that. I mean, I was lucky. I went to China in my early 20s and late 90s. And I think China was still in the beginning stages of really opening up to foreign working practices, ways of working. And if I look at my first role within the law firm that I joined, it was primarily a client-focused role, working with international clients. Because whereas the Chinese team had the local expertise, the legal knowledge, they didn't necessarily have the how to work with international clients experience. And so for me, from a career point of view, I got to do a lot more things than I would have normally got to do back in the UK. I was exposed to a lot more issues and I got promoted much quicker, I think. So for me, that was great. But I think those days are gone. I think now if you look at the average Chinese workforce, they're all international, they've all studied abroad, they all have great English. So there's no need for expats like myself at that time. So now you've got to come with a different set of skills and experience that the Chinese need. And obviously everybody's different. So it's been very good for me, but I don't think I could do what I did now. I think that it's a very different landscape. I still want to make it positive though. China's great.
Yeah, Allison?
I'd agree with that to a point. I mean, I was a little more recent coming to China, moved there professionally in 2018. So I agree with Ross on the point of I had a lot of opportunities earlier on than I think I maybe would have had working in the US or the UK. My job was working with international students. So my Chinese team got to do a lot of the logistics, but I got to do a lot of that communication similar to how I'm doing now with you all. That being said, I do think that there's still a market for carving out those skills, but it might require a little bit more diversity, either in what type of industry you're going into. I know a lot of people came in as English teachers because that's an easier transition, I would say. And then you can kind of launch into your career aspiration and niche interests. Also not looking at the big cities anymore. I know my experience has been only in Beijing and Shanghai. But I think moving forward, we might see more diversification on tier 2 cities. And a lot of these cities are still fantastic and global cities. I do agree with Ross that it is getting harder. And I probably came in at the end of that. I think it's still possible, but you need to be a little bit more entrepreneurship and be willing to put in the work time. As we mentioned, people have fantastic work ethics. So being able to put in that time important at this point, I think.
Excellent, thank you. I have a very interesting question here. It says, in regards to engaging with people virtually, in the UK, I typically spend a couple of minutes engaging in personal chat before discussing work when on Zoom meetings. Is this expected with Chinese colleagues as well? What do you think? Like having a small chat before jumping into work?
It's a difficult. I mean, that's definitely the way that I like to work. You know, you want to make that connection, and you know, I want to check in and make sure that everybody's okay. I can't talk for anybody else. I mean, I don't know, Helen. I don't know.
From my point of view, I think that depends on what kind of person you are talking with. Usually, for those person with a high ranking, a big title, and I think for a formal meeting, we just talk to the topic directly. And for those similar. I mean, for those colleague worker or just the colleagues all days working around you, just talking like a in-person chat, and anything I think is welcome by them to talk before the formal topic, working topic. So.
Yes, Alison.
Yeah, I would add to that as well. And I fully agree with Helen that hierarchy comes in very importantly here, that I wouldn't really start this conversation with the CEO as casually as maybe one of your peers, or maybe even your direct supervisor who you're working with on a day-to-day. I can't speak virtually since all my experience was in person with my Chinese colleagues, but I will also say I found a culture developed on WeChat amongst my peers. And as we mentioned, WeChat, the work-life balance has broken down a lot. So there's a lot more community, and I liked it when we got to a familiar enough level to be sending stickers or communicating more casually. I found that helpful with my peers, but that wouldn't necessarily be something I would ever do with the head of a company. But that was kind of just my experience as well.
Yeah. So we have another question. Someone is asking, how common is 996 in China right now? That is work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. You left, Alison. So is this like a Chinese saying, like a Chinese?
I do think that hours tend to be a little bit longer. I will say I was lucky in that I never experienced the 996 mentality. I think maybe this is also being a foreigner living there, that a few of my Chinese friends were expected more Saturday hours. I think also holiday structure is something that some of you may encounter depending on the time of your internship, that you'll see holidays in China. If you have this week off, you might be expected to make up some of those days on the weekends. You'll see this with Golden Week or with Chinese New Year, that making up the hours that you were off has become common. But in terms of 996, I don't think I knew that many people who had that rigid of hours. There tended to be some flexibility, but slightly longer than what you'd expect. But great question.
I mean, to add to that, I would say that 996 is definitely more prevalent than it is in the West. Definitely more prevalent in certain industries. So very competitive industries in China, especially the technology industries, there is a 996 culture. They're moving fast, they're breaking things, they need to get things done. And that is causing some problems. People do recognize that is leading to burnout, to depression, to stress. But to be honest, there are so many engineers out there that are looking for jobs, that these firms know that they can push their staff hard for a number of years and get away with it. But I think the government now is reflecting on this practice. They see it as a worrying trend. Mental health and well-being is becoming talked about a lot more. So we may see those type of working practices may change over time. But I think Chinese in general, they work incredibly hard. They move very quickly. So yeah, it's definitely an Asian thing maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So if anyone has another question, please write it in the chat before we start wrapping up our session. Helen, would you like to add anything on what we just discussed?
No, I think for the last two questions, I have some. I think 996 is not compulsory. It depends on yourself and your personal time schedule. So it's just a kind of working culture, but not for all of us.
Nice. Okay, we have one question. So we're going to take this last question, and then I could ask to the speakers to reflect on one funny story that happened to you, right? Perhaps due to miscommunication, cultural, something funny that you said, oh my God, this is a funny story, okay? So how welcoming the Chinese workplace is to different types of people, countries, races, what do you think? How welcoming and open is it? How would you say?
Mata, I think this is good questions. And from my working around my friends, my Chinese friends, I could see they are very welcome to the foreigners to work together with the foreigners, no matter which country or which race or just they're open mind and they want to communicate, even though their language not good. You can communicate in both English and Chinese and other language. They're open to learn different countries, learn from different countries. People learn from different language. So I think that China is open and modern and fast developed. So welcome every foreigners to come to work with us together.
Excellent, thank you. Does anyone want to complement that, or do you have a funny story to share about something funny, yeah, that happened to you in China? Still thinking.
Well,
Ross,
I mean,
maybe, yeah.
just one. I mean, I think it's to do with like personal hygiene, I guess. Very different approaches to blowing one's nose. I think in the West, and me in particular, you know, a handkerchief and really blowing into the handkerchief, you know, if you need to, is frowned upon. And the idea that we would then put that handkerchief back in our pocket and use again later on, whereas the Chinese, you know, far more subtle and would use paper and throw away. That's very different. I think squat toilets is another one. It's just a cultural difference that, you know, it's not just unique to China, but, you know, this part of the world. So I think, you know, you'll still find that. So that can be a challenge and can some interesting situations. But yeah, so many wonderful experiences.
Excellent. Allison?
I think a lot of my travel stories across China, depending on the region, tended to be pretty entertaining. That throughout my 4 years in China, I probably went on every form of transportation possible, from, you know, the very rickety trains to the tuk-tuks to the scooters to however you were getting around. I remember there was one time I got on a train, opened up my compartment, and there was just a bunch of goats inside. And maybe it was just my communication that I was not anticipating that. But then I've had the other side where I was supposed to be picked up in what I thought was a tuk-tuk, and it ended up being a very nice SUV. So kind of the disparities of really keeping an open mind when you're going into these experiences. I once had a guy just lend me his horse just to be nice because a car couldn't travel on the road I was going on. I don't know how to ride a horse, but they were still so opening of, why don't you take this and we'll help you get to where you're going. So I found Chinese people in general to just be very welcoming, very open, but there's definitely some funny situations you'll always find yourself in.
Amazing. Well, thank you, all of you, for sharing all your learnings and your experience in China. This has been very, very interesting and useful. And just before we leave, Allison, if anyone here has any doubt about their program start day, when will they find out, or any specifics, who should they reach out? What email? Do we have an email?
Yes, you can always absolutely reach out to your intern experience manager, your point of contact within virtual internships. So you all should have gotten an intern email from your intern experience manager. Again, this for most of you would be either Michaela or Nadia. And if in any doubt, you can always reach out to me and I can help direct you. But your intern experience manager is kind of your point of contact. Well, also, if you ever have any questions about navigating your host company or navigating your internship in general, we want to hear from you on a weekly basis. So you can absolutely always reach out to us. Thanks, Mirta.
Excellent. Thank you, Allison. So you can all stay in touch with our speakers, Ross Parsonage, Helen Fan, Allison Ross. You can find them on LinkedIn and you can connect with them. And so thank you, everyone. This has been super interesting. I appreciate you all coming here. And well, I wish you, for those who are starting your virtual internship, a good start. I hope you really enjoy your time. For those who have finished, I hope you really enjoyed it. And we'll see you next time then. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. And thank you, Allison, Helen, and Rose for being here today.
Yes.
Bye.